we are expecting to hear from the president while he is in Scotland today, where he's hoping to highlight the U.S. commitment to fighting climate change while he's attending a global conference focused on the issue. He arrived in Edinburgh early this morning after spending the weekend in Italy for the G20 summit. There, he met with other world leaders to take on climate change and some other global issues. And Mark Phillips joins us now from Glasgow to discuss the summit. Mark, good to see you. So, when the G20 ended with what some activists are calling a, quote, weak commitment from world leaders on climate, I wonder how this could complicate negotiations at COP26.
Well, the obvious question emerged out of the G20 meeting, which is if you can't get the 20 most prosperous countries in the world to agree on how to approach climate change, how are you going to get 200 countries here to agree? Of course, there's a distinction between the rich ones and the poor ones, and that's part of the problem here as well. But all of the signs leading up to this conference, which many are seeing as a make or break conference in the fight against climate change, all of the signs are not very encouraging at this point. This conference, COP26 they're calling it, that's because there have been 26 or 25 previous meetings of world leaders to try to come to grips with exactly the issues that are still on the table here. And as I say, the indications at this stage are not that they're going to make any breakthroughs. Already there's as much blame being thrown around as there is ideas on how to solve issues. One of the great issues here, of course, is the cooperation that existed before the Paris Agreement between the U.S. and China, which made the Paris Agreement, the landmark Paris Agreement, possible. China's not even here, or at least the Chinese President Xi Jinping is not actually here. Vladimir Putin of Russia is not actually here. And the whole point of these conferences is face-to-face meetings where pressure can be put on leaders, where feet can be held to the fire. That's hard to do when they're not here.
We've learned that President Biden is set to unveil plans to help poorer nations tackle climate change. As we know, often when it comes to poorer nations, they feel the brunt of climate change. But also, you know, they're a little further or not as far along as, you know, we may be in this country when it comes to green technology and all that sort of stuff. So what can you tell us about this plan?
Well, this is one of the big divides at this conference between what we call the geographic north and south, the prosperous parts of the world and the less prosperous. The argument in the developing countries is, why do you want us to make all of these cuts and sacrifice economic growth by not having access to the same sorts of fossil fuels, cheap coal, cheap power, oil, that you relied on to develop your prosperity over the past 200 years? Now, we're here in Glasgow, which is one of the great industrial cities of Britain. There is huge shipbuilding works here for several hundred years. There still is to some extent. This place was built on steam engines, powered by coal. The less developed countries are saying, if you can do it, why can't we? The second part of that argument is, and this has been considered, is how do you compensate the developing world for the adaptations it'll have to make, for how it will generate its own power, for developing of renewables and that sort of thing. And there was an agreement that to start with, there would be a $100 million fund per year that the rich countries would pay the poor, and that fund was supposed to be available as of now, and it is not. Nobody's come up with the money. The U.S. has upped its stake, but they're still considerably short of the $100 million promise per year. Now it's said it won't happen before 2023. And what's more, the $100 million was just a start. That money is supposed to go up to $500 million a year, and nobody's even talking about that.
Mark, in your report that you filed earlier this morning, you pointed out that the president called out the leaders of Russia and China for not showing up in person for the climate summit. What impact might their absence have on the talks this week, and where are they on the record as far as climate change is concerned? I mean, maybe just because they're not here, could it potentially mean that they are still committed to some of the policies that will be talked about during this week?
Well, they're not committed to the extent that the G7 countries and most of the Western world is committed. I think it's 12 of the 20 of the G20 are committed to what we're calling a zero carbon economy or a net carbon zero economy by the middle of the century, even by 2030. China's last statement was that they would peak their carbon production, peak their use of coal and other types of fossil fuels by 2030 and then begin to diminish, and that they didn't see themselves getting to a net zero until 2060, which is 10 years later. But all of this stuff, 2030 is, 9 years from now, 2050 is almost 30 years from now. These seem like problems very far into the future. The point at this conference is that these decisions have to be made now. This next decade is critical, and if these decisions and commitments as to how you produce the power that you need from renewables, as to how you compensate the developing countries to not use hydrocarbon fuels. These decisions are what were supposed to happen at this conference, and as we head into it, as I say, all the indications are that they're not going to reach the kinds of comprehensive agreements that they previously said were necessary.
President Biden's climate envoy is John Kerry. He will be in attendance. He has been a key figure when it comes to climate change talks and negotiations, particularly when it came to the Paris Agreement. What is his role now at this summit?
He's been very busy up until now. As we know, he's been traveling the world, twisting arms, figuratively, one presumes, in the lead up to this. And it's very interesting. We don't know exactly what the effect of those discussions have been, but it's very interesting. In the period in the run-up to Paris, it was described by the organizers of that conference that the U.S. and China came into the room virtually hand in hand, that the Chinese had been convinced that their future lay in the renewable world and not necessarily in the use of fossil fuels, and that they were on side. That made the Paris Agreement possible. They're not here, or at least their leader is not here. There have been discussions leading up, in the days even leading up to this conference. There's still a lot of mysteries as to what China will put on the table, if anything, in terms of improvement. But you're right, President Biden yesterday singled out China, he singled out Saudi Arabia, he singled out Russia. The Chinese and the Russians, as we said, are not here. That means arm twisting is pretty tough to do at long distance, and these face-to-face meetings, which have been the way these things have been worked out in the past, simply can't happen.
And yet there's got to be something done, because many scientists have said we're at a critical stage here when it comes to the health of the planet. Mark Phillips for us. As always, Mark, we thank you.